Hello, welcome to my first ever YouTube video. This will be part of a series I'll be doing on upcycling for a project for school. You can learn more about upcycling by checking out my other videos or by going to my website. For this video, I will be showing you how I transformed 2 t-shirts that I thrifted into a new outfit to give them a new purpose. I'll be making a crop tank top and a matching skirt, but you can modify this to make a shirt with sleeves and a pair of shorts. I want to keep my intro short, so let's get right into the process. To start off, you'll need a top and bottom to base your design off of and trace. I will be using a crop tank top and a denim skirt. You can modify these if you want, like I made the straps of the top wider than the tank top I used and the neckline higher. For this design, I wanted to create a color block design which will add a step for making the front and back pieces of the top. For the front, you want to mark how much you want of the first color. I went with about 2/3 pink and 1/3 gray. Draw a line down the front of where the first color will end. Then add 1/2 inch for seam allowance. Next, you want to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the entire trace top and an inch seam allowance at the bottom for the hem. When you're done, it should look like this. For the skirt, I wanted a gathered skirt, so I will trace out a box and use the length of my skirt for the reference. Make sure you trace out the box along the fold of the thrifted shirt, so that way it'll be one long piece of fabric when you cut it out. You want to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the side of the skirt and an 1.5 inches for the waist or more depending on how big you want your waistband to be. Before you cut each piece out, label them, that way you don't get confused later on. The next step is to cut out what you've traced, making sure to cut through both layers of the thrifted shirt. If you have a stretchy fabric like mine, make sure you do not pull the fabric and cut slowly and precisely. Also make sure that the fabric is not bunched up or misaligned when you begin cutting. Now you want to take the back piece you cut out for the top, making sure to flip it to the right side. Draw a line in the same place as you did for the front piece. This time you will add the 1/2 inch seam allowance to the other side of the line so that you have 1/3 in this color for the back, which will match up with the 2/3 gray fabric to make the entire back piece. Label this and cut it out. The next thing you'll want to do is layer pieces onto your shirt. They may or may not fit, so you want to double check to see if you can cut all the pieces out at once or if you'll have to open up the shirt. You want to start by laying the skirt piece onto the other thrifted shirt and cut it out to be the exact same size. Make sure you pin this, that way the fabric doesn't slip around as you cut. To open the shirt, I cut around the sleeve, shoulder line, and diagonally across. That way I'd have more fabric to work with. Once I opened the shirt up, I placed the 2 pieces for the top in pink on top of the gray shirt and pinned them. That way they won't move when I cut them out. Now that you've cut out your pieces, you can unpin them and arrange them to see what the shirt will look like once you are done. You can see how the 2 pieces for the front and back will line up. Now you want to put the 2 pieces for both the front and back of the shirt right sides together. It will be helpful later on when you are sewing to mark where the first line you drew is on this side of the fabric. That way when you are sewing you know where to sew and the 2 pieces will match up perfectly. Remember to do this for both pieces, for the front and the back. For now, we will switch back to working on the skirt. Lay out the fabric so that the right sides are together. Pin along both sides of the fabric. You may need to trim up some of the edges so that they match a little better, like I did. Going back to the shirt, pin along the new line we drew so that way you can sew and create full front and back pieces. If you're using a stretch fabric like me, make sure you're using a stretch or ballpoint needle and a zigzag stitch. Here are my settings for my machine, but yours may be different. Next, you'll want to sew along all 4 lines that we pinned. Be sure to use back stitching whenever you start and end sewing. One helpful tip is to use a piece of tape to mark where your fabric should line up. That way you sew in a straight line. Once you're done with this, you'll now have a full back piece, full front piece, and the skirt is almost finished. The next thing we want to do is sew the shirt together. Do this by laying the 2 pieces right sides together. Pin along the side seams and the shoulder seams. Now you want to sew along these lines that you pinned. When you are done, your shirt will almost be finished. Now we'll go back to the skirt. Measure out your elastic, that way you know how much space you need to leave for the casing. One thing that I find helpful is to leave the elastic inside the casing, that way you can pin it to the right size, but make sure you take this out before sewing. You also want to mark a place to leave a gap where you won't sew, that way you'll be able to stick the elastic through later on. Here's me sewing up until that gap. Be sure to backstitch. Now you need to put the elastic through the casing. I find it helpful to attach a safety pin, that way it's easier to guide through the casing. The next thing you want to do is pull both ends outside of the casing, that way you can sew them together. Be sure to overlap them enough, that way you won't have too much difficulty when sewing them. Also, make sure that the elastic is not twisted inside the casing. When I sew my elastic, I like to use a zigzag stitch, that way it can still stretch. Then close the casing. I forgot to mention before that you should use a regular straight stitch for the waist, since it will be gathered and does not need the zigzag stitch for room to stretch. I also like to add a couple stitches around the waistband so that the elastic does not twist inside the casing. Now that the skirt is done, we will finish the top. Fold the bottom of the shirt up about 1 inch and iron all the way around. Don't burn yourself like I did. Then pin this down and sew using a double needle if you have one, or using a zigzag stitch to allow for stretch. With the hem done, we need to finish the armholes and neckline. Cut out 2 bands of equal length for the armholes. Mine were about 16 inches long and 1 inch wide. Cut out another band for the neckline. I did not have enough space to cut one continuous band, so I cut out 2 strips about 10 inches long and sewed on both ends to make a loop. Also make a loop for the 2 armholes. For each loop, fold and iron in half. This may be difficult if you have a thinner band like mine, but keep trying. Attach the raw edges of the loop to the raw edges of the armhole. Pin all the way around and sew. You should be sewing through 3 layers of fabric. Repeat this step for the neckline. You may need to stretch the band as you sew, so that way when you flip the edges to the inside, it is smooth. Lastly, fold the edges in and iron everything down. Here's what my final product looks like. you so much for watching my video, and I hope you learned something new about upcycling or about sewing. I hope you try out my process and make sure to tag me so I can see what you've created. Thank you!